This is our 5th great lesson. And we started with how Earth was created. And we found that Earth settled down by all of the elements obeying their laws. And then we saw how the Earth was disturbed and how life came as a response to that disturbance. And we had life on the Earth, and we had that wonderful timeline of life, which ended in the culmination of life with human beings. And remember that human beings couldn't have survived before that very end of the time in the coming of life. And then we had our 3rd great lesson with the story of human beings, the coming of human beings, and the things that make human beings special and different from all other creatures. And then the last great lesson that we had was the story of communication and signs, where we learned of one of humans' great accomplishments, a written language. And today is our final great lesson, where we learn of the 2nd major accomplishment of human beings. In our story today, the story of numbers. We've talked about the fact that human beings needed a language so they could talk to each other. They needed to share their ideas with each other, tell stories to each other, so they had a language that they spoke. Then we found out how they learned to write the words that they were speaking. And we heard that story in communication and signs with the Phoenicians. Well, in the same way that they needed a language to talk about their inventions, they needed a language to talk about their discoveries and their measurements. They needed to be able to talk about how far they had walked, or how many caves they might need for that night if it started to rain. How many caves would we need to get everybody safe in out of the rain? They needed to have some language for how many and what and how far is it to the river. Something that everybody could understand. When would the fruit start to grow on the trees again? All kinds of things to do with number. Well, sometime, and we don't know when, in one of those long ago, far away places and times, people started to figure out a language with numbers. They started to, everybody from the very beginning had, of course, had some way to talk about numbers. I mean, we all have our fingers with us, right? And maybe that was the first way that people began to talk about numbers. We don't need to write anything down. We just all have our fingers with us. And I bet you all have used your fingers sometime for numbers, to add something up or to subtract something. Haven't you all? Yeah, I have too. Many of the early cultures had some kind of language for one. And the number 1 might be their word for alone. So that same word alone could also stand for the number 1. And other early cultures might have had words that stood for 2 and 3 and 4. Most of them went up to 10. An awful lot of them did. But beyond that, an awful lot of the early cultures of human beings, they had no word for numbers beyond 10. Everything beyond that was just a whole lot, or many. Even the Indians who lived here, the Tongva Indians, no numbers for beyond 10. Well, that worked a little bit, but it didn't really work for many people long term. I mean, some groups of people, in keeping track for counting, use groups of stones or piles of rock to keep track of a quantity. Others use notches on a stick or knots in a rope to keep track of numbers. And for a long time, that's how people kept track of quantities, kept track of numbers. Here's how the Malayans kept track of things. You can see here, one stone for number 2. They had 2 stones for 3, 3 stones. That's very simple, isn't it? And then about 5,000 years ago, there was a group called the Sumerians, and many of you have been doing research about the Sumerians, right? Yeah, many of you have been doing research about the Sumerians. They could read and write. They had their own reading and writing. They had an advanced civilization. And they had marks for their numbers. And their way of writing has been called cuneiform because of the shape of their marks. They had a lot of clay in their area, and they would roll that clay into these flat tablets. Then they had sticks, and in the wet clay, they would make certain marks, both for numbers and for words that they wanted to say. They used a stick to press into the wet clay. Then the clay dried, and thousands of those clay tablets have been recovered. So we know a fair amount about those early Sumerians. Then the Egyptians were farmers who lived around the same time as the Sumerians. They were very successful at selling their products. The Egyptians were great traders. And they needed very big numbers to represent their quantities. So they developed also a system of writing for numbers. And another group of people who came after the Egyptians and who took over the Sumerians were the Babylonians. And here's what their numbers look like. And of course, all of these charts that I'm going to show you all sit over there in the math area. So you can look at these anytime you want. There's their number for 1, 10, 60 times 10. They have a multiplication problem there. 23. Interesting, huh? And of course, you can see their wedge-shaped marks. Remember how they used cuneiform that they got from the Sumerians. You can see those wedge-shaped marks that they have here. Well, remember in the story of communication and signs, how the Greeks took the Phoenicians' letters? Well, the Greeks also took other people's numbers. But the Greeks had a different way of doing it. They decided to mark for each letter, to make a mark for each letter that was the first sound in the word for that number. So, if you look at 5, their word for 5 was penta. So the way that they wrote the number 5 was with their letter P. And for 10, their word was delta. So this was their letter D. Deca, I should say. That became the symbol for the number 10. And here's how a Greek child would write 2,857. Isn't that something? Doesn't that look like a lot more work than the way we write it? And then just like in the story of communication and signs, the Romans then came in, took over from the Greeks, and here are their numbers. And they used Roman numerals. And we still see some of these Roman numerals today in the fronts of buildings. Sometimes the building will say it'll have some old Roman numerals in it. And look how that Roman child, look how the 11-year-old Roman child would write 1983. Can you imagine doing long multiplication with that? What a lot of work that would be. Now, all those charts that I've shown you so far, the ones pretty much looked all the same, didn't they? But look now. Here are the Chinese numerals. And look at that number 1. The 1 is on its side, isn't it? Take a look. It's lying down. It's like taking a nap. Okay. Now here you see the 1, the 2, and the 3. And if I put a diagonal line between those two lines for the number, for the 2, it kind of will make a number 2 like we have it. And if you take a look at the Chinese 3 and you put 2 lines in them, it could kind of make a number 3 like we have. There are some people who believe that our numbers came originally from the Chinese. Yeah. Well, where did our numbers come from? The numbers that we use. Although we don't know for sure, the first findings of the numbers that we use, that look just like the numbers that we use, are in the inside of a cave in India. They're very similar to the ones that we write. Now, the numbers that we use are called Arabic numbers. Did you know that? Our 1, 2, 3, 4, all the numbers that we have, 1 up to 0, and all the numbers that we can make from those numbers, they're called Arabic numbers. And what's strange about this is that even though they're called Arabic numbers, the Arabs never used them. See, the Arabs at the time were great traders. They traded with people from India, and they traded things from India over into Europe and all over the world. And the people, the Arabs, brought so many things back in their trading, including books. And in one of those books, they seem to have gotten these numbers. We know that this book got passed on somehow to somebody in Europe. This is taken from that book that was published over 1,000 years ago, and you have to read it from right to left. But these are just like those numbers that are on the side, the inside of a cave in India. Don't these look something like our numbers? Yeah, they do. So the numbers seem to have come to us through the Arabs, even though they didn't use them. And there's some people who think that our numbers should be called Hindi Arabic numbers to reflect where they came from. But it wasn't until books began to be used and printed and made available to many, many more people that the way to write our numbers became standardized so that everybody was using the same kind of numbers, so that everybody was writing their numbers in the same way. That's all the result of printing and books. And there's another interesting thing about these numbers that were found in India. Do you remember the zero game? Jump up and down 0 times? Or tell me 0 words? Well, the Roman numerals didn't have a 0. The Greeks didn't have a 0, but the Indians did. So that means that you can write any number you want just using those numbers from 1 to 9 and putting a 0 and using that 0 in the correct place, putting it exactly in the right place that you need. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 0. And with just those numbers, we can make any quantity, we can make any number that we want. And once again, we have someone, somewhere, to be thankful to. Someone somewhere came up with these ideas of writing down and recording quantities in signs so that we can use them now. Somebody thought of developing a much simpler number system. Much simpler than the way the Romans wrote, the way that the Greeks wrote, the way that the Babylonians wrote. And it's to that person or those people whom we can be very, very thankful for and thankful to them. There are a couple of other charts I want to show you just for a minute. And then all of these charts will be over there between those two math shelves. We'll look at then the changes in our numbers. Just in writing 1, 2, 3 from 1197 AD, 1275, the difference in how the numbers that we use were written. These look very much like the ones that we use. That's when they began to be printed. So many books began to get printed then, in this time. And I thought you might be interested in this too, in these Egyptians. This is how they wrote the number 1. And for them, the symbol was a staff. And look how they wrote 10. This is how they wrote 10. It's a heel bone. And you can look at these others and you can copy them down yourself if you want and record things that are on this chart if you have an interest. But it does give a very different idea of how numbers can be written. And that's my story for today.